Good afternoon. Welcome to Duquesne University, those of you who are visitors. My name is Jim Swindoll. I am the interim director of the Center for, or the Consortium for Christian-Muslim Dialogue here at Duquesne, which has been in existence for about 12 years, I believe, somewhere around there. And what we do is what we're here for. We're here to discuss issues that are integral to the relationships between Christianity and Islam, but also basically all world faiths and world religions. One of the things that we often do is to have a meal at Thanksgiving for all of the various faith traditions represented here at Duquesne to send representatives to. So that's one thing we do. We also have quite a bit of lectures and so forth that we do here, like this afternoon. So it's really with gratitude that I see everyone here and those of you who are online. And just a couple of things just on the mechanics of this evening is that Dr. Constantine will give a lecture here, and then there'll be a question and answer period, all of which will be recorded, or not recorded, but at least live streamed to our people online. So during that question and answer, if Dr. Constantine, we would like to have people take a microphone so that people who are hearing it live stream can hear you. So that's just a little bit of the mechanics of that. I'd just like to basically acknowledge all of the sponsors for this afternoon's lecture. The City of Bridges Foundation, with whom the Consortium for Christian-Muslim Dialogue has a great and ongoing relationship. The McAnulty College of Liberal Arts here at Duquesne is a co-sponsor. Duquesne's Mission and Identity, African Studies here at Duquesne. The Department of Catholic Studies, the Department of Theology here at Duquesne, and the Interfaith Student Organization are all contributors to this event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Khulud Salman, who's an associate professor of nursing here at Duquesne, to make our introductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues and students. I'm very happy and excited to see you all here and to welcome you to this seminar, which will focus on Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, relationship with the Christian and what they mean today. I hope that the presentation will fill the gap of knowledge that we may have related to historical relationship of Prophet Muhammad with other religion, as well as it may enrich our understanding about respecting each other faith. I would like to thank our partner, the City of Bridges Foundation, who helped us organizing this seminar. And a special thanks to our speaker, Dr. Greg Constantine, who accepted our invitation. And we tried very hard to make it happen. It took a lot of efforts and arrangement for him to be here. So thank you very much. Also, as Dr. Swindoll, I echo Dr. Swindoll and thank our sponsor for this event. And I also would like to let you know that there are copies of Dr. Greg's book, and it will be sold in a discount, right, Dr. Shubna? And if anybody interested, and it will be also signed by the authors. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Shibnam to introduce the Dr. Constantine, the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. Dr. Considine is an award-winning professor and the best-selling author of The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. He is recognized as an authority in interfaith dialogue, particularly in Christian and Muslim relations. Dr. Considine has written 7 books for the field of Islamic studies, including People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounter with Christians, Muslims in America, Examining the Facts, Islam, Race, and Pluralism in Pakistani Diaspora. Throughout the years, he has peer-reviewed articles have appeared in Sociology and Religions, Sociology and Religions, and his op-eds have been published in Newsweek and Foreign Policy. Dr. Considine's opinions appear regularly in the leading news and media outlets around the world. He is also experienced in filmmaking, having directed the critically acclaimed documentary film Journey into America. Dr. Considine has spoken to audiences for Oxford University, the University of Edinburgh, Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin, and the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. He is a practicing Roman Catholic with ancestral roots mainly in Italy and Ireland, but also England and Scotland. Craig is a native of Needham, Massachusetts. He holds a PhD in sociology from Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin, and MSc London in international relations from Royal Holloway, the University of London, and a BA in international relations from American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Considine.
Greetings, everyone. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to walk around a little bit instead of standing at the podium. Thank you all so much for giving me your time today. It's a pleasure to be here in Pittsburgh, or as Benjamin, my host, has been telling me, Hillsburg. It's really an honor and pleasure. I thank everyone at Duquesne that was responsible for putting together the event. I know there were 7 or 8 entities at Duquesne. So thank you all so much for putting this together. And of course, thank you to the City of Bridges Foundation for bringing me here. It's been quite a long 2 weeks for me. I was in Illinois about a week and a half ago. I went back to Houston for a day to teach. Then I went to Abu Dhabi, and I was in Abu Dhabi for 4 days. And then I went back to Boston, where I'm from, for 36 hours. And then I came to Pittsburgh, and tomorrow morning at 4:30, I'm heading back to Houston. So this is a great way to end a great little 2-week journey. So, People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. This book was recently published by Hearst University in coordination with Oxford University Press here in North America. And this book is really a biography of Prophet Muhammad's life, told through the prism of his interactions with Christians, which is largely going to be the focus of today's talk. But I also want to alert you to the fact that the book is really as much about Christianity and the history of Christianity as it is about Prophet Muhammad's life and legacy. So if you do end up picking up the book, you'll notice at the very beginning, there's a chronology. And I start the chronology in year 0, which is when Jesus essentially passes on. And then I bring us right up into the year 632, which is when Muhammad passed away. So the book covers an expansive historical period, really 7 centuries. The first chapter of the book begins when Muhammad is 12 years old. And for those who may not be familiar with Muhammad's biography, when he was a very small boy, he lost both of his parents, and he became an orphan. This is one of the reasons why Muhammad was so passionate about defending and uplifting orphans, because he himself was an orphan. So he loses his parents at a very young age, and he is placed into the care of his uncle, whose name is Abu Talib. And from a very young age, Muhammad is basically attached to the hip with Abu Talib. And Abu Talib was essentially what we would consider today to be a businessman. Excuse me. He was a businessman. And essentially what he did was he brought these trading caravans from Mecca all around the region of the Arabian Peninsula, but also as far north as a city like Damascus in modern-day Syria. So Muhammad, from a very young age, is traveling to all of these cities. He's going to Mecca. He's going northward to a city like Petra in modern-day Jordan, visiting places like Gaza in modern-day Palestine, going to Jerusalem, and up to Busra. That's where the book starts, in Busra, which is in modern-day Syria. And various historical sources tell us that when Muhammad was 12 years old, so the year 582, he was born in the year 570, in 582, Abu Talib's trading caravan stops. And it stops right by a cell, a Christian cell. Some folks refer to it perhaps as a monastery, but it was a place where Christian thinkers, philosophers, let's call them monks, actually dwell. And Abu Talib was invited into a cell by a Christian named Bahira the monk. That's what the historical sources tell us with regards to the name. And the book details Muhammad's encounter with Bahira. And long story short, because I have a lot of stories to get to today, ultimately Bahira is so impressed by Muhammad, even though Muhammad was just 12. Bahira actually identifies Muhammad as someone with very special gifts. And Bahira even identifies Muhammad, according to various sources, Christian sources and Islamic sources, as being a forthcoming prophet. Muhammad is identified as a prophet at the age of 12 by a Christian named Bahira. And the book outlines Bahira's identity. Who was Bahira? Now, of course, we're talking about the 6th century. The sources are quite old. But I actually suggest that Bahira may have been a Nestorian Christian. And the Nestorian Christians are a little bit puzzling to modern-day Christians. You know, you don't roam around Pittsburgh or Boston or Houston or anywhere in the modern-day Middle East, and you don't see a lot of churches, or perhaps any churches, that say the Nestorian Church. But you have to go back to the year 431 to essentially capture the Nestorian identity, the Nestorian creed. And it was in this year, 431, at the Council of Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And the Christians of the time were having a big debate over the nature of Jesus. Was he divine? Was he half divine, half human? Was he fully human? Who was he? And the Council of Ephesus essentially focused on a priest or a Christian thinker named Nestor. And Nestor was essentially claiming that Mary, Jesus' mother, Mary was not the birth giver of God. Mary was not the birth giver of God. The Council of Ephesus refers to this as Theotokos. But rather Jesus was, or rather Mary was the birth giver of Christ, the Messiah. So Nestor didn't really place a lot of emphasis on Jesus' divinity, being perhaps the Son of God. Rather, actually, you know what? Going back to the Council of Nicaea, is anyone familiar with the Council of Nicaea, 325, a really monumental year when we talk about modern-day Christianity? My last name, Considine, is the Irish version of Constantine. Constantine being the first emperor of Rome, bringing Christianity to the Roman Empire. In the year 325 of the Council of Nicaea, this is essentially when the Christian empire establishes the Trinity as the official doctrine of faith. So Nestor, coming 100 years later, was considered essentially a heretic. And actually, a lot of the Christians that Muhammad engaged with during his time would be considered by the Christian powers of the time to be heretics. Nevertheless, 582, it's a Christian who first identifies Muhammad as a potential prophet. Now, moving forward in his life, so I'm going to move chronologically here. So we move on from 582, and as I mentioned, Muhammad is visiting cities like Petra, Gaza, Jerusalem, Busra. All of these cities were part of the Byzantine Empire. So when Muhammad is traveling with Abu Talib in these trading caravans, he is meeting a lot of Christians and a lot of different groups of Christians as well. The book refers to Muhammad as a young boy as someone who we might identify as a cross-cultural navigator. This is one of my favorite sociological terms. I'm a sociologist by training. A cross-cultural navigator. That he was actually someone who had the ability to kind of move in and out of different, let's say, cultural circles. He had cultural skills because he was actually immersing himself in a lot of diversity. I think for a lot of people, when they think of Muhammad as a young boy, or even Muhammad as an older man, somehow he's divorced from this diversity, that he's just living in a desert and there's just a bunch of pagan tribes who happen to be Arab. But there's a lot more diversity around the Middle East throughout his life, and he encountered a lot of different groups of Christians. In the year 595, when Muhammad was a young man, when he was 25, he marries Khadija. Now, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Christianity, but I think it's very important to recognize who Khadija was. In my previous books, I've emphasized Khadija's professionalism and her integrity and her wisdom. So I'll pause here before I get back to the Christian identity element of the book. But Khadija was a fascinating woman. She's 15 years older than Muhammad. She was 40 when she asked Muhammad to marry him. This is very rare, even in the current context. Women don't typically ask men to marry them. But Khadija did that with Muhammad because Khadija knew that Muhammad was a good businessman. He was upright, he was forthright, he was trustful. And they were actually business partners too. So Muhammad moves from Abu Talib to Khadija, but he's still in the same type of business, engaging in this type of cross-cultural navigation, traveling throughout the modern Middle East and seeing all these different Christian communities. So now we're with Muhammad when he's about 25. When he is between 25 and 40, we have the young Muhammad as someone who I identify in the book as a religious mystic. A religious mystic. This is also something, this term mystic or mysticism, it's often neglected in discussions about Muhammad. A lot of people, especially in the United States, see Muhammad as really kind of rigid and even extreme. But here was a person who was a thinker. He was enlightened. And he liked to spend time in isolation, thinking about the mysteries of the world, thinking about our Creator, thinking about God. And he used to isolate himself. And he used to go to Mount Hira, a cave on the outskirts of Mecca. And in the year 610, he's alone in this cave. I believe you can visit this cave. I don't know if anyone's been to Mount Hira before. You've been, yes, a couple of you have been. So it's a pretty small little cave, and Muhammad is in there all by himself, isolated, and he is basically shaken by a force. And he's kind of awakened. And Muhammad is stunned, right? It's almost like a ghost has appeared to you. And who was this kind of spirit that visited Muhammad when he was 40 in the year 610? It was the angel Gabriel. Now, angel Gabriel isn't a Christian per se, but I'm sure the Christians in the audience know the importance of angel Gabriel in the story of Jesus. The angel Gabriel is the angel or the spirit that came and visited Mary to essentially introduce the idea of Jesus coming into the world. So Mary is visited by Gabriel, and Muhammad is visited by Gabriel. And this in itself is quite symbolic. Now, Gabriel, again, is not a Christian, but the point that I'm making in the book is that Gabriel is influential across these different religious traditions. So that's in the year 610, and this initiates, for those who may not be familiar, the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad. So Muhammad leaves the cave, he goes back to Khadijah, he is puzzled, he is frightened about what just happened. I don't know if anyone in here has had kind of a transcendental type of experience where you're not sure if something really just happened. It could have been like an illusion. So Muhammad goes back to Khadijah, and Khadijah says, no, you know, everything that just happened to you is real. And Khadijah says, let's actually go verify what just happened to you by visiting my uncle. Waraka ibn Nafal was Khadijah's uncle. And Waraka, as I document in the book, and of course I'm building off of previous scholarship, Waraka is said to have been himself a Christian, perhaps an Ebionite Christian, or some type of branch of the Jewish Christian sect. And I explain all of this in detail in the book. And Waraka confirms what Khadijah had recognized. Waraka says, actually, this is real, and you're going to be like a new Moses. That God is going to give you a new set of doctrines, a new set of laws to implement in the surrounding community. So again, it's a Christian that is essentially the second witness to the beginning of Muhammad's actual prophethood. Now, this is obviously quite symbolic in itself. In the year 613 now, for 3 years, Muhammad is receiving these revelations, which of course is documented in the Quran. But Muhammad was keeping these teachings silent. He wasn't going public with them. In the year 613, he decides to go public, and he starts sharing these revelations and these new teachings and messages in the public sphere. And of course, being in a largely tribal and pagan society, the power structures in play were frightened and perhaps even threatened by Muhammad because he's bringing a completely new system into the fold. And one of the individuals that ends up being a close companion of Muhammad is Bilal ibn Rabah. And I was talking about Bilal last night at the Turkish Community Center. Bilal was said to have been half Abyssinian, modern-day Ethiopia, and half Meccan Arab. Now, given that he was half Abyssinian, there's probably a pretty good chance that he had some ancestors, perhaps even his mother, who was Christian. Modern-day Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian countries in the world. So we don't necessarily know if Bilal was a Christian per se, but we do know that he was one of the early followers of Muhammad. And in other books, I write about Muhammad's approach to Bilal in terms of their friendship and how this friendship actually was one that symbolized Muhammad's approach to race. And I mentioned this last night. Muhammad was not merely a non-racist. He was actually someone who we could identify as an anti-racist. Right? So this is someone who is actually energetic in terms of trying to counter and dismantle in many ways some of these racist structures that we have in society. So we're in the year 613 now. We have about 21 years left until Muhammad's passing. The year 615 is arguably one of the most important events when we talk about Christian-Muslim relations, historically and into the modern day. The persecution that the Muslims were facing in Mecca, again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, Muhammad's bringing in a completely new way of life and system into society. And the Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, which was the dominant tribe of the time, are persecuting the Muslims very seriously, even murdering people. And Muhammad is fearful that the community may not survive, that they might be killed off, or people might lose their faith or quit their faith because the persecution is so tough. So what does Muhammad do? Muhammad encourages a group of Muslims to take up all of their belongings from their home and travel westward across the Arabian desert to a port, Al-Shuaibah, on the Red Sea. And Muhammad tells them there's going to be a boat there, and I want you to get on this boat, and I want you to cross the Red Sea, and I want you to go to Abyssinia, which is a Christian kingdom. And Muhammad tells the Muslims, it's there you're going to be welcomed and you're going to be protected. Now, this is a massive leap of faith. Imagine you doing this with your family. And some of you in here may have experienced something like this, being refugees, because that's essentially what they were. So they get to Abyssinia, they get to Aksum, the ancient capital of the Abyssinian Empire. And we have several beautiful stories coming out of this initial encounter. One surrounds Jafar. Jafar is one of the companions of Muhammad. And Jafar is in the court of King Ibn Abjar, a Christian king of Abyssinia. And Jafar is reading verses of the Quran about Jesus and about Mary. And the Islamic sources, many of them tell us that King Ibn Abjar was so moved by the reverence that the Quran had for Jesus and Mary that he wept until his beard was wet, and he wept until his scrolls were wet. Now, the Quraysh, who I mentioned earlier, being in Mecca, the power players in Mecca, they actually followed the Muslims all the way to Abyssinia. And they also went to the court of King Ibn Abjar to petition King Ibn Abjar to send these rebels back to Mecca. And King Ibn Abjar refused. So this is a Christian king defending the early Muslim community at its most vulnerable time. And we have some great lines from the Islamic sources. King Ibn Abjar saying things like, "Not for a mountain of gold would I give these people back to you." And there's another story coming from the Islamic sources that King Ibn Abjar in his court picked up maybe a stick and drew a little line in the sand. And he told the Muslims, the differences between my community, the Christians, and your community, the Muslims, is no greater than the line in the sand. Now, I think this is an extraordinary story, one, because it relates to perhaps modern day stories or experiences pertaining to refugees, but it's also important because King Ibn Abjar was serving as an ally that was even willing to jeopardize his own political survival to defend people who were vulnerable. So this is a powerful story too. Moving forward, the year 619. This is referred to as the year of sorrow in Muhammad's life. He loses his wife, his beloved wife, Khadija, and he loses his uncle, Abu Talib. And these were two of his primary supporters. And again, we're talking at a very vulnerable time for the Muslim community. 2 years after the year of sorrow, it's the city of Jerusalem that appears as a symbol of hope for Muhammad, the night journey to Jerusalem. And this is perhaps a miracle story, perhaps a dream, perhaps something that happened in reality. But in short, what this story is about. Muhammad is once again guided by Angel Gabriel, and he gets on the back of a kind of a miraculous being called Burak, and they fly all the way to Jerusalem. And eventually, Muhammad is guided by Gabriel to the 7 stages of heaven. So Muhammad is actually seeing things that even a lot of prophets had never seen. And I believe it's the 3rd stage of heaven where Muhammad meets 2 men that look almost identical to one another. Does anyone know who they are? John and Jesus. And with Jesus, Muhammad says that they are essentially brothers. They're like brothers, but they have different mothers. That they're essentially kindred spirits, which is really a profound statement in itself. I like to think of Jesus and Muhammad as 2, let's say, leaders that engaged in the old ancient Hebrew saying of tikkun olam. Tikkun olam, Tikkun space O-L-A-M. It's an ancient Hebrew word referring to healing a fractured world. And this is essentially what I think Jesus and Muhammad came to do, to heal a fractured world. So it's interesting, at Muhammad's lowest point in life, it's Jerusalem, it's Jesus, John the Baptist. And he ends up meeting Moses and Abraham and Adam and various prophets of the Abrahamic tradition. Now, 622 comes, the 2nd Hijra, the 2nd migration of Muslims away from Mecca. Muhammad is invited by warring tribes in the ancient city of Yathrib, which he later renames Medina, which means the enlightened city. And Muhammad is essentially invited as a peace broker, because you had pagan tribes and Jewish tribes who were fighting each other. You had pagan tribes who were fighting each other and Jewish tribes who were fighting each other. So Yathrib was really a mess, and it had been for generations. Lots of violence, theft of land, and so on. So Muhammad goes, he's invited to settle this conflict. And several scholars, and I mentioned this in the book, have noted that there were Christians, a very small group of Christians that were in Medina at the time. They weren't large enough to really have any significant power, but they were nevertheless there. They weren't part of the signing of the Constitution of Medina. Has anyone heard of the Constitution of Medina? This is something that's easily Googleable. The Constitution of Medina in the year 622. This is the end product of Muhammad's engagement with these warring tribes. And essentially what we have in the Constitution of Medina, and I argue in the book, it's similar to what we today think of as a civic nation. A civic nation is one in which anyone, regardless of who you are, can belong to. It's like a contract. It's like an opt-in. You can opt in to it, regardless of your ethnicity, race, religion, so long as you believe in the political principles that are outlined in a constitution. And the Constitution has over 30 articles in it. And several of these articles emphasize rules or laws. The Jews, the Muslims, and the pagans all had sovereignty over their communities. So the government could not interfere. The government couldn't force any of these communities to, let's say, produce a certain book in a certain way. Or they couldn't interfere in their religious affairs. You had in the Constitution of Medina what we today would consider freedom of religion. People were able to openly practice their faith. People also had the ability to dictate or have a say in political affairs, right? So you had a voice, and everyone was equal. And even more importantly, these tribes were mutually dependent upon one another. So if one tribe was attacked, the whole tribe was attacked. It's quite similar to what we have in this country with our republic, right? So if North Dakota is attacked by Canada, never going to happen, but well, perhaps it would, I hope not. But you get what I'm saying. If they are attacked, Massachusetts has to come in and help them. And so does the whole Union. It's a confederation, it's a republic. That's what Muhammad created with the Constitution of Medina. Now, Christians were not, again, as I mentioned, they weren't powerful enough to be part of that constitution, but they were there. And it would be, I think we would be mistaken to think that Muhammad wouldn't provide the same liberties to Christians as he would to various other communities. So that's the year 622. From there, we enter a somewhat violent period for the early Muslim community. I document this in detail in the book, the various trials and tribulations which often ended up in violence and in conflict. But on the grand scheme of things, we're not talking about world wars, we're not talking about even massive regional wars. They're relatively small skirmishes. Nevertheless, it had a big impact on the early Muslim community and the surrounding nations and the surrounding tribes. Muhammad did engage in violent conflict as well with the Byzantine Empire, the Battle of Mu'tah, if you might be familiar with the Battle of Mu'tah. But I make it clear in the book as well that the conflict did not necessarily have anything to do with, let's say, doctrinal or religious or theological differences. Really what we're talking about is the political fallout of empires fighting each other. I didn't mention this earlier, but when we talk about Muhammad's life, so 570 to 632, the Arabian Peninsula, think of a map here. To the west of the Arabian Peninsula, to the northwest, is largely the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian. To the east of the Arabian Peninsula, northeast, you had the Sasanian Empire, or the Persian Empire, and they were Zoroastrians. So Muhammad is kind of wedged in the middle. And it makes you kind of wonder, well, who would Muhammad probably naturally be allied with? Would it be Christians or might it be Zoroastrians, given all the similarities noted in the Quran between Islam and Christianity? I also didn't mention earlier, before we move forward and I wrap up, in the year 619, the Byzantine Empire lost Jerusalem to the Zoroastrians. So this is in the year of sorrow as well. Now, that's symbolic too. Muhammad is living in this time when even the Christian empire is kind of crumbling. It's kind of falling. And then after Muhammad's death in 632, a kind of vacuum happens, and Muslims end up taking Jerusalem. Okay, two more stories before we open it up for a discussion. The year 630 is probably my favorite encounter between Muhammad and the Christians of his time. Muhammad is basically making himself known to various regional entities, nations, politicians, that this new community called the Ummah, Muslims and Islam, is on the horizon, and it's gaining steam. And Muhammad writes a letter to a community called the Christians of Najran. Najran is a city located in southern Saudi Arabia, northern Yemen, modern day. And at first, the first letter that Muhammad sends, the Christians of Najran kind of are like, who is this person claiming to be the new prophet of this Abrahamic tradition? And they say, no thanks. But Muhammad, being persistent, sends another letter, and the Christians of Najran accept. So a group of bishops and scholars and diplomats from Najran who are Christian go up to Medina at Muhammad's request. And there is a 3-day diplomatic affair in which Muhammad hosts the Christians of Najran in his mosque. 2 very important stories unfolded in this 3-day diplomatic affair. The first revolved around a very serious discussion about Christology, the nature of Jesus, which I touched upon earlier with the Council of Ephesus and the Council of Nicaea. The Muslims were pushing back a little bit against this idea of the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus, and the Christians obviously had their opinions as well. But the sources tell us that the 2 sides essentially agreed to disagree, and they had a very difficult conversation, but it was a cordial one, and it enhanced understanding, which is so critically important to modern-day affairs, where there's oftentimes a complete absence of dialogue, but also oftentimes with interfaith dialogue events, a superficial dialogue, where we just kind of all think that it has to be all kumbaya, and we can't really talk about anything difficult. But that's not what happened in the year 630. They really kind of got down and dirty with Christology. The other part of this story in 630 pertains to the Christians of Najran seeking to pray. And they inform Muhammad that it's time for them, the community, to engage in prayer. And they let Muhammad know that, Muhammad, we're going to kind of slide out the back door here, and we're going to carry out our prayers outside. And Muhammad stops them essentially in their tracks and basically says, well, why would you leave the mosque to pray when you're already in a house of God? You can pray here, which is really a radical idea, even by today's standards. Not just Muslims perhaps being a little hesitant to invite Christians into their mosque today to pray, but a lot of religious communities would not be comfortable with this idea of opening their door to a different religious community so that they can worship their God in a different space. In the book, I refer to this entire episode in 630 surrounding Muhammad and the Christians of Najran as one that we can distinguish tolerance from pluralism, right? So we have religious tolerance, religious pluralism. When you think about the word tolerance, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there something a little standoffish about tolerance when you just tolerate someone, right? Like I have a 2-year-old daughter, and she does some things that, of course, I don't approve of, jumping on the couch and jumping off the couch and acting like a gymnast. But nevertheless, you accept it. You tolerate it. But in a serious way, when we talk about Christian-Muslim relations, when we merely tolerate each other, I feel like it actually might reproduce the exact thing that we're trying to overcome. When you feel tolerated, perhaps it's a good thing, but I also think it can impact our self-esteem. It can impact our sense of belonging, that we really don't truly feel like we're part of the team, that we're part of the community. Muhammad was moving beyond tolerance. He was engaging in what I refer to in the book as religious pluralism. And I take this concept of pluralism largely from Professor Diana Eck of Harvard University and the Pluralism Project. Professor Eck is saying that tolerance is actually not enough for a religiously diverse society like the United States, that there's something deeper, there's something more energetic and active that needs to take place to build proper relationships. And I think that's what Muhammad was essentially doing. Right? Opening his door to the Christians, a completely, a community that would be identified really as largely strangers. But he said, no, you're here. And a criticism that I often get in talking about this story, people say, so, what are you saying? So if Muhammad is opening his doors and allowing Christians to pray, then is Christianity and Islam equal? Is it the same thing? And I said, let's not even talk about this kind of power relation, which religion is better than the other. Let's just merely think of this through the prism of hospitality. That's essentially what Muhammad was doing. He was trying to make people feel welcomed. And in doing that, I don't think he was necessarily sending a signal that you're jeopardizing your faith by doing this. I think what he was actually signaling to his community is that being hospitable is part of your faith, and it's actually an act of faith. So as we wrap up, 632, Muhammad passes. Close to his death, we're told by Islamic sources that he was informed that King Ibn Abjar had passed away. Some of his companions told him that. Muhammad is said to have prayed for King Ibn Abjar, is said to have honored him, even perhaps suggesting that he would see King Ibn Abjar in heaven, which is really a big claim, because that suggests that, according to the Islamic tradition or Islamic doctrine, even Christians can go to heaven too. We also have the farewell sermon in the year 632. Christians are not mentioned explicitly in Muhammad's final message to his people, but we also have another important signal of Muhammad's approach to racial equality. If you're familiar with the farewell sermon, you'll note that he said, and I'm paraphrasing, an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. A white person has no superiority over a non-white. A black has no superiority over a non-black, except in piety and in good action. Now, this links to one of my role models growing up, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 1963, he gives his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And Dr. King says, and I'm paraphrasing, I hope one day my 4 children will live in a country where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Virtually the same type of message. Muhammad said it in 632, in a different part of the world, through the lens of Arab identity, Islamic identity, let's say Middle Eastern identity. Whereas Dr. King is coming as a descendant of slaves, he's an American, he's a Westerner, and he's a Christian. And I think that one story right there is so important for Christians and Muslims today. Samuel Huntington's theory has been popularized, the clash of civilizations, right? This idea that the West and Islam are on a collision course, and they always have been, and we have mutually incompatible values. But what about the farewell sermon? What about the I Have a Dream speech? 2, I'm not saying small speeches, these are huge speeches, but 2 examples that can kind of bust open this idea of the clash of civilizations. I'll end by alerting you all to my current research, which is focusing really on Christian-Muslim relations through the prism of civilizational interactions. We have Samuel Huntington, this idea of conflict and clash. This is violence, this is exclusion, this is discrimination. We have the dialogue of civilizations, which was introduced by former president of Iran, Mohammad Khatami, in the year 1999 at the UN. And you might envision here, when we talk about the dialogue of civilizations, it's the antithesis of the clash. It's about people coming together, having this dialogue, being hospitable. But what I'm arguing is that there's something even beyond the dialogue, just as there's something beyond the tolerance. And I'm referring to it as the synthesis of civilizations. So there is something beyond this dialogue, this tolerance, and we have contemporary examples like the House of One in Berlin. Is anyone familiar with the House of One in Berlin? If not, I highly suggest you Google this as well. So we have in Berlin a single structure, and inside this single structure is a mosque, a church, and a synagogue. And in between these three buildings is a civic space, a secular space that everyone can share, essentially. Now, that's something beyond this mere dialogue and tolerance. It's almost like a new paradigm of interfaith relations and even civilizational interactions. I would also like to end by saying that the book is dedicated to Pope Francis. As a Catholic myself, Pope Francis has really completely reinvigorated my faith. I didn't think it was possible to have a pope to talk about Christian and Muslim relations the way Pope Francis has. He has talked about the dialogue of civilizations. He signed a document on human fraternity. I also encourage you to Google that, with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University in Cairo. This is a beautiful document talking about our common humanity. And he also provides us with the concept of the culture of encounter. The culture of encounter. And what this is, again, it's deeper than a dialogue and it's deeper than a tolerance. He's telling us not just to listen to people, but to hear people. There's a difference. Don't just listen to people, hear people. And this is part of the solution to Christian-Muslim relations in the contemporary context. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to receiving some of your questions. Of course, as I tell my students, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So let it rip. And it can be personal or it can be academic, whatever it might be. So let's open it up for some questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really beautiful. I actually thought that you were Muslim because of how...
You wouldn't be the first person to say that.
Yeah. You're speaking so nicely about Prophet Muhammad. I was like, but he doesn't say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam after he says his name, so it doesn't make sense.
Sometimes.
But then you said Catholic, so...
Yeah.
So how much time do I have? Because I have a lot of questions, actually.
I mean, maybe... yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so it's really beautiful what you talked about, and actually, I'm not sure if you talked about in your book. There's a lot of incidents where, like, the Christians actually were seeking help from the Muslims. So just like what happened in Abyssinia, and the Muslims, like, kind of got the help of the king there. Same thing happened in Egypt. The Christians actually sent to Umar ibn Khattab, which is the second caliph, asking him for help against the Byzantine Empire. And even Christians, until today, I saw like a Christian priest from Egypt actually sending thanks to Umar ibn Khattab for sending an army to help them. So I just wanted to touch on the political aspect, right? Because we see the king of Abyssinia applying, the peaceful message of Christianity and helping the Muslims, right? But then you have the political part in the Byzantine Empire that's affecting even Christians in Egypt, and then the Christians in Egypt asking for help from the Muslims. Another thing was the king of, so you talked about the conflict between the Byzantine Empire and Prophet Muhammad, but there was also the king Al-Muqawqas in Egypt at the time of Prophet Muhammad. When he sent him a letter, he actually responded in a peaceful manner,
Yes.
and the Prophet had like peaceful relations with him.
I talk about that in the book too, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I do, yeah.
So there's a difference between the political aspect of like a civilization or an empire and actually whether they actually apply the message of their prophets or not. So that's something maybe you can touch on. The other thing that I wanted to kind of like mention was also that when the Mongols invaded, and this is another thing which is part of the, the kind of like the message of tolerance and living peacefully together. When the Mongols were trying to take over the world and the Muslims were fighting against them, there was actually Christians fighting side by side with the Muslims.
Yes.
And the Christians that were captives, that were captured by the Mongols, Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the scholars of the Muslims, he was making a peace treaty with the Mongols, and I don't know if you talked about this in your book, did you?
No,
Okay.
I didn't. No.
Okay. So he was literally telling them in the peace treaty, the Mongols were saying, we're going to free the Muslims only, but we're not freeing the Christians. And he said, no, our Christian brothers should be freed before the Muslims in order for us to sign that peace treaty with you. The last thing that I will ask about, but this is something I want you to look into, because in Islamic theology, and the same in Christian theology, we can live peacefully with each other, right? But when it comes to the theology, who's going to heaven and who's not, this is something, even though we disagree, but we still can live peacefully together and, have tolerance and everything. So when you mentioned that the king of Abyssinia, where the Prophet prayed janazah for him, which is this, like the scholars, the bulk of the Muslim scholars, they say, is because that king actually converted to Islam.
Yes.
Because no one is allowed to pray that particular prayer for a dead person unless that dead person is a Muslim. So I just wanted to clarify that.
So the second point, and largely the first point too, like the kind of political dynamic of things. My next book is largely focusing on the historical trajectory of Christian-Muslim relations around the world. I have 7 chapters at the moment. First chapter, Arabian Peninsula. Chapter 2, Western Europe. Chapter 3, Turkey, Eastern Europe. Chapter 4, I go to South Asia. Chapter 5, West Africa, then the US, and then the Holy Land. And I look at the clash, the dialogue, and the synthesis. So like kind of the bad, the good, and the great. And throughout history, you have examples that fit into all 3 of these theories. And one that actually sticks out off the top of my head is actually rooted in Egypt too, with the Wafd Party. Are you familiar with the Wafd Party, right? You're Egyptian, yeah. So you might be able to explain perhaps what happened between a huge contingent of the Christian Egyptian population and the Muslim Egyptian population when they were engaging in nation building. The Wafd Party's slogan and symbol was the cross and the crescent. And I think this is important to recognize because, again, a lot of the contemporary discourse is like clash of civilizations. Christians and Muslims have never got along, or if they have got along, it's like this kind of superficial interfaith dialogue where we all pat each other on our back and everything's great. But there have been countless moments throughout history where Christians and Muslims are actually joining together in political formations and kind of building empires too. Other historical moments that we can look at, Western Europe, countless examples in Andalusia, not just between Christians and Muslims, but the tolerance showed by the Muslims towards the Jewish populations. In modern day Sicily, in a city like Palermo, we have what I refer to as the other Al-Andalus, in which Muslim leaders were essentially the chief of staff to these Norman kings in modern day Palermo, King Roderick, and so on. So there's countless examples in which these 2 groups are uniting in the political sphere. The third thing that you mentioned with the prayer, and I mentioned this in the book, of course, it's an academic book, so you have to look at all these different angles. I've heard so many different opinions and academic perspectives on whether it's possible within Islamic theology for a Christian to go to heaven. I'm not even going to kind of make any ultimate claims on that. Like, who am I to determine anything when it comes to the afterlife and people's fate and people's souls? It's nevertheless an interesting subject, thought-provoking one. I hope it doesn't ever get so intensive that it basically emerges as a source of separation and division between us. So thank you for that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate so much variety from what you had to say, and I have several questions, but I'll just perhaps ask one, and if nobody else, then I'll go to the next one. Okay. When you talked about getting down and dirty, okay, in the kinds of conversations, I'm thinking contemporary. Do people want to really have wholehearted conversations, or do you ignore subjects and know this other person? I mean, well, on a personal level, a family level, as well as when you get into some of the conflicts in our country now. And you say, can you really be full-hearted, fully express yourself? And so it seems to me, what I heard historically, and not just in the example you use, probably in other places, where there have been these experiences of people being fully, and then being able to dance with that, allow it to happen. And one of my observations about that is if I feel really insecure, then I'm going to feel threatened by somebody else's view. Yeah. But if I'm pretty secure in what I believe and can hear the other person, then I don't have to write them off or become violent towards them. So I just think we might need to have more, so to speak, down and dirty conversations.
Thank you for that. If I can add something, that is also going to be coming out in my next book. At the moment, the book is titled Deuce. And for those who may be familiar with my work, this is a concept that I've been building for quite some time. It's like a peace sign and 2. When you think of deuce, it's like the letter, the number 2. So this is like a process of engaging in pluralism. And it starts with the D, which is dialogue. So when we have an interest in sparking the bridge building process between Christians and Muslims, the last thing we should do to initiate this process is to take our holy books and to put the holy books down at the table and start talking about these holy books. Think about how silly of an idea this is, really. Complete strangers coming together, not having any sense of camaraderie between people. So the D for dialogue is not dialogue theologically, it's like a human dialogue. This is when we can come together and we can talk not about being Christian and Muslim, but we can talk about more neutral terms, like being a father, a son, a colleague, a neighbor, and an employee. And largely, this needs to happen over food, the ultimate kind of bridge builder or neutral entity. So if you do that, you begin the process of building rapport, and I think this helps people feel comfortable. People might be more inclined to speak their mind, to speak their truth, because they feel a bit safer. The E is education. This is where we take it a step further. Let's maybe bring out our books and we can start really getting into maybe some controversial passages or some ideas, like the gentleman over there was mentioning. I mean, think about it. I'm sure some of you have had a teacher who you just don't feel comfortable around. And you kind of shut off and you kind of distance yourself from this person. You don't really accept the whole journey of learning and being properly educated, because there's something disconnecting human beings from each other. So we start with the dialogue, we go to the education, then we move to an understanding. And the understanding does not have to be a large group think or consensus. This is where we can actually live with difference. But we understand people's positions. We can agree to disagree. We can see eye to eye. If you have these 3 things, then we move into the realm of commitment. And commitment is when we can outline our principles, between communities. This is what we stand for. If something happens to your community, this is what we're going to do. If something happens politically, we're going to come out and we're going to stand for this. It's like writing a constitution. The House of One, which I brought up earlier, you can find their constitution online, and it's actually quite brilliant. One of the clauses talks about politics. None of the entities involved in the House of One can make any overt political statements or make any overt political allegiances. Now that might get a little hairy at times, but the E of Deuce is engagement. If you have all of these things, you've begun the dialogue, you've connected as humans, You introduce and educate one another on your religious backgrounds. You come to a mutual understanding. You've joined forces and you've entered a partnership with communities. Then you go out and you engage in the public sphere and you actually show your community, you show the nation, and you show the world that this partnership is not merely possible, but it's actually happening. So this is a process. And to have these down and dirty conversations, we can't just go like that and expect people to all of a sudden open up, you know, and be vulnerable and to make mistakes. That comes with time, and it comes with a lot of effort. I often tell my students, and they get really ticked off when I tell them this, like, how much skin are you willing to put in the game? How much energy are you willing to exhort? How many times are you willing to make a mistake? How much are you willing to put your ego aside? Are you really willing to learn? And these are some really fundamental questions that I think we all have to ask ourselves to really properly build a bridge. Yes, ma'am.
In that area of vulnerability, I'm just wondering, I think it's very important that we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And the first step, perhaps, for instance, an example in my own life, I work and minister in the Black community. And so very often, I'm the only white person around the table. So it's an experience of being the minority, to flip-flop that and simply listen. That was the first stage. And then you start growing in that dialogue and sharing. So I think growing and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable is important.
Absolutely. And I think in conjunction or to the side of like a vulnerability, we also need humility. You know, like you can't come to the table with a superiority complex. Like you can have your faith, you can have your political beliefs, and that is what it is. But you also need to be able and willing to change, to learn, to listen to perhaps ideas that can make you a better person. I know for me in my journey, the vulnerability started when I was a sophomore at American University in Professor Akbar Ahmed's class. He's an anthropologist at American, and he brought the whole class to the mosque. And this is like 3 years after 9/11. And I was still kind of had some ideas about Islam that were largely coming through to me in the media. And I was a little hesitant, I'm not gonna lie, when I walked into that mosque right on Mass Ave in Washington. But I remember Imam Magid, who's now based in Northern Virginia. He came out of the mosque and he was just glowing with happiness and joy, and just went right up to Dr. Ahmed and gave him a big hug. And like just something as simple as that, I was like, okay, I feel a little better now. And then you just kind of, you let it roll, you know? And I think this vulnerability too, like, and I tell my students this, like, don't be afraid to make mistakes. You know, like, you don't know everything. And you're gonna make mistakes. You know, like you might walk into a mosque for the first time and you might forget to take off your shoes when you enter the prayer area. And someone might get really mad at you. And let's say someone is, you know, saying, you know, get out of here. And I tell my students, I said, at that moment you have to pause. If you get upset, that's your ego. You know, are you there? What are you there for? Are you there to learn, or are you there to do something else? Vulnerability, humility, and the ego, all these three things together need to be handled very carefully. Thank you for that comment, ma'am. We had another comment. And then we'll go to the gentleman here.
You know, very nice presentation, by the way.
Thank you,
I loved it. You know, we believe, Muslims, we believe in Torah, Bible, and of course our holy book, the Quran. Do you have any information about how did the Prophet perceive Bible? Although he was unable to read and write, and the Bible was in different language, but did anybody teach him about the Bible or told him what is in the Bible?
This could easily get me into trouble saying this,
No,
but
I am
I'll
I
say
am
it.
curious. I always ask myself this question.
Yes.
So thank
Okay,
you.
so I'm currently reading a book by a scholar named Charles Tsietzen, Tsiezen, and he deals with early Christian literature on Muhammad's encounter with Christians. And a scholar like Dr. Charles reiterates in many ways some of the things that I talked about in this book, though not to the detail he gets into. But I think Muhammad was quite familiar with Christian theology. I think there is a pretty good chance that Muhammad may have come across Christian scripture. He was a cross-cultural navigator. He was traveling around the Arabian Peninsula, cities like Jerusalem, Busra, Damascus. He had an uncle like Waraka ibn Nafal. And I think just the kind of rational, plausible person in me thinks that it's quite possible. But let me also be very careful. I don't necessarily agree with the argument that Muhammad was taught by Christians, or that the revelations that he received weren't divine. I think there's a big distinction, and a careful distinction that needs to be made there. Yes, do I think he was familiar with Scripture? Yeah, I do. But it doesn't negate the glory of the Quran and the divine nature of the Quran. But part of the contribution of this book is just to kind of look at the historical context in which he was living. He was very likely familiar, perhaps with even some of these discussions within Christianity, like the Council of Ephesus, 431. Who was Mary? Was she Theotokos? Was she Christikos? Who were all of these different Christian communities in the area? I think he was familiar with them. I think he was curious about religion. He was a searcher for knowledge throughout his life. So did it inform him? Yes. But I still think the Quran is part of the divine plan, if I could say that. I hope I handled that carefully.
We
Yeah.
have many stories about Christianity and Judaism in our book, in the Quran, than Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam or Islam.
Yes. And let me add too, like a lot of the traditional Islamic sources critique Christianity, saying that it has kind of been taken astray, that it's kind of lost its original meaning. And I think this is a valid statement. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's a valid statement because I think what Muhammad was essentially suggesting is that people like Nestor, during the Council of Ephesus in 431, his idea of Christianity basically lost out. Right? In the Council of Nicaea in 325, you had Arian, or let's say more conservative Unitarian Christians, saying no, like the Trinity is not the official Christian doctrine. It's this. So in some ways, Muhammad, in this message of Islam, aligns more closely with Christian groups that were labeled heretics. And that doesn't make Islam a heresy either. It's just that his revelations, receiving these revelations aligned more closely with Christian communities that were essentially pushed aside and kind of exiled within Christendom. Yes.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to ask one of those small academic historical questions that may be important, may just be a bit of minutiae, but have you found any Syriac Church of the East monastic sources that actually de-emphasize the divinity of Christ? I'm not talking necessarily about documents of bishops or anything, but especially thinking about these marginal monastic communities that the Prophet may have come into contact with, and where, we know that the Syrian Orthodox tradition will be very different from, a Church of the East in the Persian Empire. But what have you seen anything, or is a lot of this extrapolation?
A lot of it is extrapolation, I think. I'm not really an expert on ancient Christian texts. the Syriac tradition. The book that the author I just mentioned, are you familiar with it? Charles, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Tsiezen, T-S-I-E-Z-E-N. He is a scholar on early Christianity, and he looks at all of these texts that are not only engaging with what Christian thinkers were saying about Muhammad, but he also engages in a lot of these kind of sects. I will say that the book doesn't really focus so much on the Syriac tradition, but I do dive deeply into this idea of a Jewish Christian. Are you familiar with like the Ebionites? And some of these kind of Jewish Christian groups that wanted to maintain the halakha or Jewish laws and Jewish rituals, but they didn't necessarily believe in the divinity of Jesus. I deal more with that. Perhaps you might offer something with, are you more familiar with the Syriac literature?
We can talk after.
Okay. Yeah, fascinating.
Well,
Yeah.
One thing I will say is the Church of the East, the sort of Syriac Nestorian churches, in like the 400s, sort of established themselves as the Christianity of the Persian Empire, as opposed to the Greek.
Yes.
So they,
And now we get into politics now, right? So now it's like, okay, Constantinople, the center of Christendom, is trying to basically keep astray this other community that is close by, that has similar beliefs, but they have different beliefs. I mean, this is what a lot of scholars say with the Council of Nicaea, that Constantine was largely responsible for creating the Trinity in order to convert all of these pagan communities, many of which had already had a concept of the Trinity. I know in the ancient Irish pagan tradition, you had a concept of the Trinity. You had the underworld, you had this world, and you had the above world. St. Patrick, do you know why the shamrock is the symbol of the Irish people? That 3 branches? It's because Patrick knew that this idea of kind of threeism is quite similar to the pagan tradition. So politics can't be kind of divorced from any of this stuff. We had a question here.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That was enlightening. I just wanted to mention the idea of respect for different religions. That's a fundamental principle in Islam that is laid down in the Quran. You have to respect all religions. The fact that Prophet allowed Christians to come into a mosque and knew very well that they would put a cross up there and they would make the sign of the cross and they would have that, was in his mind the idea of respect for those individuals. The second aspect I wanted to say is that the Quran is littered, to use a wrong word actually, about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam and Muslims. It talks about mosques and synagogues and churches and cloisters, which involves individuals that are Sabians. And it preaches, in fact, the idea that all of these individuals have the ability to go to heaven. You have nothing to grieve. That is a statement in the Quran, not once, many, many times. That's all I wanted to say about unity in religion.
So the first point with respect, I couldn't agree more. And this is even bigger than, religion. I mean, respect should be the bare minimum for all human endeavor and all human engagement. But it's literally like the bare minimum. It's like I think we need to raise our standards. I was actually just meeting, some of you may be familiar with the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. This is a community that is violently persecuted in Pakistan, and it's initiated a lot of conversation in the United States. The Ahmadis essentially believe, if I can kind of speak on their general behalf, they believe that a person in the form of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was the Messiah. So the Quran talks about the coming Messiah. Jesus is coming back. And the Ahmadis believe that their founder from Qadian, India, is the Messiah. And this is not a view that a lot of Muslims around the world are comfortable with, but nevertheless, this is their position. And I met their leader, His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad, in Zion, Illinois, at the beginning of this journey. And I was with him for 15 minutes, and he brought up respect. And he said, this is fundamental, it's the bare minimum, and then we moved towards love. And that's like the peak, that's the pinnacle that we need. And the second point that you mentioned, sir, you mentioned synagogues and mosques. There's also an extraordinary set of documents, which I actually didn't bring up in the talk, but it's in the book. It's actually listed as an appendix in the book, and this pertains to the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of his time. Again, a lot of scholars, this is one of the issues that scholars are pinpointing, saying that these documents are fraudulent, but there's also extraordinary work being done in countries like Qatar and UAE, legitimate scholars who are actually saying these are legitimate treaties. Most of the treaties, one of which is with the Christians of Najran. So earlier we were mentioning 630, the Christians of Najran left, they went back, and they are said to have left with a covenant. And part of the covenant said that Muslims are not supposed to mess with a church, that churches are allowed to exist. This is part of the kind of divine mission. But the covenants also go further, saying that even if a church fell into disrepair, it's an obligation of the Muslims to actually repair that church. The book, the quintessential book on the covenants, was written by a scholar and friend of mine named John Andrew Morrow. He's actually from Canada. He's a Métis Indian who converted to Islam when he was a young man. He published this book in 2013, 2014. And when I got a hold of it, I was absolutely blown away by the content of the covenants. I didn't know about the covenants. And at the same time, around the world, ISIS was just running absolutely wild and rampant and destroying churches. But the covenants are saying the exact opposite. It's saying, you know, definitely don't destroy churches, but actually protect churches. Are you familiar, y'all, with a beautiful project called Revive the Spirit of Mosul? It was initiated by UNESCO, part of the United Nations. It was also backed by various European countries and also backed by the UAE government. And this was a project initiated in 2018 after the 3-year occupation of Mosul by ISIS. And ISIS just destroyed pretty much any resemblance of Christianity, not only in Mosul, but all around the Nineveh plain. By the way, Mosul, you know what Mosul means? Anyone know what Mosul means in Arabic? It means bridge. So Mosul has always been a place of different cultures coming together. It's always been a kind of melting pot. That's been its identity. And ISIS chose it and destroyed it. But this project, Revive the Spirit of Mosul, was essentially spearheaded by Muslims, not just Muslim governments, but Muslims in Mosul, to completely rebuild all of these churches, which is really a stunning example of compassion, but also like redemption. You know, bringing these ancient Christian communities back to life. I mean, some of these churches, the Al-Sanna Church and Al-Tahira Church, I mean, these are beautiful buildings, just ruined. And Pope Francis was there a couple of years ago. Basically alerting us to what had been done by a group like ISIS, but also what is being done. I know the UAE government gave $50 million to repair what had been broken in Mosul. So I think Muhammad would be very proud of that. You know, Muhammad's legacy and spirit is not dead, and Muslims are carrying his banner. And I'm thankful for that, you know, not just as a Christian, but as a human. Another question, sir.
I appreciated you mentioned about Berlin, where there were these three major religions. In a few weeks here in Pittsburgh, we will remember what happened at Tree of Life.
Oh, God.
And how beautiful the community came together. It was such a beautiful experience. And one in my memory, some of you may, I don't know if you were there, Rodef Shalom, but one of the leaders of the Muslim community was honored by Aaron Biss, the rabbi, in front of the community at Rodef Shalom Synagogue. So that memory of coming up and remembering Tree of Life and the response of this community overall was just beautiful. One of my particular questions, I wonder, as a Catholic, remembering the angel Gabriel, and how Gabriel, and I'm not as familiar, I know there's angelology in the Jewish tradition, and of course Gabriel has a prominent place in Muslim, and I'm just wondering how perhaps, for instance, a figure like Gabriel could become a unifying awareness, and also that the religions of the book, but also religions of the desert. Absolutely. That the way in which, the world in which we live, in this case the desert, in that case the desert, here in Pittsburgh, GPS sometimes doesn't work. We have bridges and rivers and tunnels, and people get confused very easily, but that's our world. So when you have the religion of the desert, and then this figure Gabriel becomes a kind of pivotal figure in the three desert religions.
Thank you, sir, and I'm glad you brought Gabriel up, because when I was researching this book, Gabriel just kept coming up over and over again. And when people ask me, you know, what was the one surprise that came out of putting this book together, I say Angel Gabriel, because he didn't just show up in 610 to begin the Quranic revelations. He was showing up over and over and over and over again. And traditional Islamic sources said Gabriel visited Muhammad thousands of times, much more so than any other prophet. There's a couple of other examples. At the Battle of Badr, one of the, I think it was 624, a decisive victory. And it was also the Battle of the Trench. I think it was the Battle of the Trench. Gabriel was there protecting Muhammad. There's also a story before the Battle of Trench. I think the Battle of Trench was 629, but Islamic sources say that one of the Jewish tribes that was part of the Constitution of Medina, which ended up falling apart, they were essentially trying to murder Muhammad. They had invited him to their village, to their camp. I mean, this is what the Islamic sources are saying. And Gabriel came and visited Muhammad and said, they're planning on doing something pretty bad to you, and Muhammad didn't end up going. I mean, these are just a couple of examples in which Gabriel is popping up. Let me also be careful here in respect to our Jewish brothers and sisters. There, in the book, I do deal a lot with the challenges that were inflicted upon Muhammad and the early Muslim community in relation to the Jewish tribes of the time. But I'm also very clear in the book that the reason why relations soured didn't have to do with theology or religion. It was largely alliances that had been broken. It's politics, essentially. And I think this is so important to remember when we think about historical early relations between Muslims and Jews, that the differences were largely because of politics. Also, I tell my students, when individuals read the Quran for the first time, they may not have any historical context to understand the nature of these verses, because the Quran was revealed in real time. And there have been scholars like Juan Cole, professor at the University of Michigan. He just wrote a book similar to mine, but he basically puts all of the Quranic verses into the context in which they were revealed. So there are some verses in the Quran that, if you read literally, don't come across as very nice towards Jewish people. And if you read it literally, you're going to say, okay, this book is anti-Semitic. But the verse was revealed in a moment of time, in a certain political context. And it's so important to understand that historical context. If you don't have that, then, and you read things literally, then Jews and Muslims are going to be locked in eternal battle forever. So context, so important. Yes?
I am so grateful for the positive presentation, which is so counter to what I hear for the most part. And you yourself mentioned ISIS, and then after the death of Muhammad, we have this conquest of much of Africa, and the fatwa, and with Salman Rushdie, and what happened? What's going on that these things become so counter to the core understanding and acceptance that you presented to us?
Very good question. I think I don't want to oversimplify, but I think it might be more simple than it is complicated. I think it's a matter of the individual's ego and the lust for power and for riches. And I think it's mixed up in greed. And I think that's important to recognize. I don't think, you can read the Quran and you can take things literally, you can take things out of context, and you can justify various things, some of which are barbaric. But if you approach the Quran looking for something that could maybe fulfill your own self-fulfilling prophecy, then you can find it. So like what is inside of us? What is it about our egos that kind of links to conquest and power and greed and lust? I think that's ultimately what it was. And I don't think Muhammad would have condoned this the violent expansion. Now, I think historians of this expansion of the time would also say that it wasn't merely violent, that the Muslims were also filling a massive vacuum left by the Byzantine Empire, because it was kind of crumbling at the time. So it was kind of a natural flow in many ways. But that's how I would approach it. I really do think it's, I don't think it's a doctrinal justification. I think it's the human ego corrupting itself in search of power. And then politics gets into it too, of course. Bernard Lewis has written a really good book. Bernard Lewis, a historian who's no longer with us, but he wrote a book called What Went Wrong. I think he published it in 2001 maybe. And it's largely about the Middle East, and he goes back to the kind of beginning of time. And he is largely focusing on the political sphere. He would largely argue that the expansion had more to do with, Machiavellian things and international relations and power dynamics. But I think it's more about the corruption of our egos. Or not even a corruption of our ego. The search for attention, for power, and money, stuff like that. Now, the Salman Rushdie thing, two things about this. I think the worst thing that Muslims themselves can do in reaction to something like the satanic verses is to respond with violence. That's exactly what, let's call them Islamophobes, want. They want the media to show this radical, violent reaction, right? So you're kind of, you're feeding the belly of the beast. But with that said, I also think that, let's refer to them as non-Muslims, need to do a much better job of doing their homework about Muhammad and informing themselves with knowledge that is more accurate of reality and, you know, historical depictions of Muhammad, and respect, right? So it goes both ways. Muslims need to do better, non-Muslims need to do better. I don't think it's just kind of pointing the finger at one group and saying, hey, you gotta sort this out. I don't think that's a healthy recipe going forward. It takes all of us to solve an issue like that. Do we have time for one more question? One more question.
Thank you. Actually, my job is an imam, so I get paid to talk. So sorry for that.
It's all right.
So I just wanted to touch on a few issues, and I hope you have an open heart. So first issue is, anytime I talk to Christian pastors, they all tell me, like, if you don't believe in Christianity, you're going to hell. And I have no problem with that, to be honest, because I study Christianity, I study Islam, I study Buddhism, and lots of other religions. And I am with like 100% conviction that what I'm doing is right, so I don't care what other people say about me. And also the fact that he's saying that if I don't believe that I'm going to hell, doesn't mean that we should hate each other or that we should mistreat each other, because the early generations of Muslims, they all believe the same thing, that, you know, non-Muslims are going to hell, for example, but they still treated them in the best way possible, right? But here's something beautiful I hope you can maybe include it in one of your next writings, because I'm sure you have a lot of audience. And this thing also, like when I talk to atheists, they find it really beautiful about Islam, which is the idea that the Prophet said there are three kinds of people that will be tested in the hereafter. So basically God says in the Quran, he will never punish anyone unless the message was delivered to them or a messenger been delivered to them. So as Muslims, we say any human being who does not receive the message of Islam, whether because they were living in an isolated area, whether because they were born with mental problems, or even the hadith of the Prophet, he says even the older person who cannot handle understanding the message, these kinds of people will be tested in the hereafter. Even someone who gets a distorted message of Islam because of the news, because of something, this person will be tested in the hereafter. So basically, you could treat a person in this world as a non-Muslim, meaning we cannot inherit from them, meaning they cannot marry my daughter, meaning they cannot, we cannot pray janazah for them when they die. But in the hereafter, they get tested and they go to heaven, right? Because of any of the reasons I mentioned. So I just wanted to make it, because the Quran is very clear about non-Muslims, especially Christians, for example. It says, those who say that God is the son of Mary, they are considered disbelievers. The Quran says those who say that God is one of three, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ ثَلَاثَةٍ, they are also considered disbelievers. So the Quran is very clear, and also the Quran says anyone who takes any religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from them. So the Quran is very clear about the non-Muslims or anyone who takes any religion other than Islam, right? But at the same time, it clarifies that if you don't receive the message for any reason, or you get it distorted or something, you have a chance in the hereafter, you will be tested in the hereafter. So this, I'm just saying that because academic Muslims will have a big problem if someone claims that, you know, Christians and Jews and are just going to heaven, doesn't matter whether they accept Islam or not. Otherwise, why would Prophet Muhammad send a letter to the king of the Byzantine Empire? And in the letter, he says to him, become a Muslim so that you get rewarded for yourself and for your people. And he said, if you don't become a Muslim, then you will carry the sin of yourself and your people, right? And then they got into war and all of these things. If Islam and Christianity and Judaism were all the truth, right, then why would he go through all of these trouble? However, we believe that Moses and Jesus and all of these prophets came with, you know, a message from God, However, this message, we believe, was changed after the prophets died, because that message was temporary, because there's a messenger coming for the end of times, which is Prophet Muhammad. The other point about Salman Rushdie, I believe also we don't agree with the fatwa, by the way, because the brother here asked. The fatwa came from Iran. Iran does not represent the Sunni Muslims at all. Anytime I give a speech, I say Muslims should never ever react violently to any of these things. I say the best solution to someone insulting the Prophet is to ignore it, because the minute you talk about it, the minute you react to it, basically you are causing more and more people to see it, and you're causing more problems for Muslims and non-Muslims at the same time. So basically this is what Islam tells us to do with situations like that. But at the same time, I feel, and I love what you said, that the blame should not only be on the Muslims. We just like there is a law against people who attack Semitism or people who attack the Holocaust, just like there is no for anyone to use the N-word unless they are African American, there should be something with regards to people insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Why is it only freedom of speech when it comes to Islam? If it comes to LGBTQ, you could lose your job, you could get fired. If it comes to Holocaust, same thing, you could even go to jail. But when it comes to Prophet Muhammad, it's freedom of speech. So this is something also that I believe that needs to change. And I really, really thank you for doing this and for the fact that you're actually talking about Prophet Muhammad in such a positive way. Thank you very much.
If I can quickly respond before the good doctor comes up. I'm about to go to New York City in a couple weeks with Imam Shamsi Ali. I don't know if you know Imam Shamsi Ali. He's from Indonesia. And when he introduces me at events like this, he identifies and describes me as a Muslim. And I don't have any problem with that. And it makes you wonder why. Why is he identifying me as a Muslim? Because I don't pray like you pray. I don't read the same holy book that you pray. And I might even have maybe some differences on the hereafter. And I've actually never asked Imam Shamsi Ali this question, but it makes me wonder, then how is he defining what it means to be a Muslim? Is it something to do with my spirit? Is it something to do with respecting people? Is it something to do with loving people? I guess it's not saying it's open for a debate, but I think people have different ideas of what it means to be a Muslim, just as they have different ideas of what it means to be a Christian. So I'll end with that. Thank you for your comment. Thank you.
Yeah, we have this room until 6 o'clock. There's still a book signing there going on. But before that, I'd like to invite Omar from the Trinity Bridges Foundation. Thanks everyone for coming.